Thank you very much, Mickey, and I want to express my deep appreciation to Mickey and the Chicago School for putting this on, especially since, I don't know if any of you know this or not, but the last time we did this, this actually gets me right into the guts of my talk. A letter was sent to the Board of Trustees of the school by Dr. Kuchar, about whom you hear much in my talk, objecting to the Chicago School for holding exactly this kind of symposium. Pressure was put on right then, and that kind of sets the theme for what I'm going to say here. My talk is about the narrative, historical narrative, as I see it from my perspective, between the APA and this issue of coercive interrogations and torture. There are a lot of other details probably that other people might want to fill in on, but this has been my experience over the past 3 years. In many ways, the growth of my own experience, because I came to this with a rather naive view of the American Psychological Association, assuming its goodwill, good intentions, and principles. And I've been, as you will see, disabused of all of that over the past 3 years. The story starts really in November of '04, when a reporter named Neil Lewis published an article in the New York Times saying that at Guantanamo, coercive techniques were used, torture was used, and that American-trained psychologists and psychiatrists were consulting to the torturers on how to use these techniques. So many of us were very concerned about this and began to talk about it on listservs and so on, and actually called Steve Benke, who's in the audience here, who's the head of the ethics committee of the APA, and he said the response of the APA was going to be to set up a task force, which they did. It's called the PENS Task Force. I'm sure many of you have heard of it, Psychological Ethics and National Security. That was the whole report, the whole work of the committee and the report was done in one weekend in June of '05. Simply looking at the report itself, many of us were disturbed by what we regarded as some major loopholes in it. In many ways, it was laudable. It said that psychologists oppose torture, don't get involved in torture, and so on. But it never questioned whether psychologists should be involved at all in places where human rights are not respected. And it relied on the ethics code, which has a major loophole in it, which says, the APA ethics code, which says that if there is a conflict between a psychologist who is given orders and the ethics code, you try to resolve that, but you can't follow orders. Which basically means if you're in the military at a place like Guantanamo or any other detention center, and you're given orders to do something that violates our ethical code, you can do that, say you're following orders. That's basically the Nuremberg defense. As far as I'm concerned, that is such a major loophole that it makes any supposed promulgation of ethical principles virtually meaningless. Also, that report relied on U.S. law rather than international law. And of course, according to U.S. law, you get the Bush administration's definition of torture, the U.S. definition of what's legal. It's very different from the Geneva Convention, and so it allows psychologists then to be able to do things that would abrogate the Geneva Convention. The other thing that really struck me about the PENS report, and I actually have a copy with me, but if I showed you the cover of it, there's something very striking about it. It just says, PENS report, psychological ethics and national security. But unlike any other task force report I've ever seen by the APA, there are no names. It doesn't say who the members of the task force are. Now the APA will tell you, and Steve Benke is here will tell you, well, everybody knows who they are. Now we do. But obviously there was an effort to cover up who the members were, because task forces usually know who the members are. They say who the members are. In this case, they didn't. Eventually, they were revealed on Division 48's website. That's Peace Psychology, and not by the APA. I'll get more into the PENS report in a minute, but I'm trying to go somewhat historically through. In July of '05, Jane Mayer published an article in the New Yorker, which some of you may have read, saying that SEER techniques were being used in Guantanamo. SEER stands for, if you don't know, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, Escape. They're techniques that were developed during the Cold War to help our prisoners of war, captured by the Chinese and the North Koreans, to resist torture techniques. And what she reported was that psychologists were reverse engineering SEER techniques. In order to go through the SEER training program, somebody has to be the torturer so that people can adapt to learning how to resist the torture, right? So what they did is, they then took, according to Jane Mayer, took those techniques that were being used as the perpetrators and were using them in Guantanamo, reverse engineering the SEER techniques. And she, unlike Neil Lewis, did actually mention a couple of names. She mentioned Morgan Banks and James Mitchell. I should say, by the way, Neil Lewis's article was taken from the International Committee of the Red Cross report, which is, of course, confidential. The Red Cross reports, if you don't know, are always confidential. But somebody, I don't know who, leaked it to Neil Lewis, and he saw it. He's the only person I know who's seen it outside of the Red Cross, and the White House. Those are usually meant just for the White House. Jane Mayer, so there were no names mentioned in Lewis's article. Jane Mayer did mention these two people. Now, Morgan Banks is not an APA member, and we didn't know about James Mitchell. Later we found out he is not an APA member either. More recently, to leave the narrative just for a moment on that issue, more recently the Office of Inspector General of the Department of Defense has made public an old report of a couple of years ago stating that Mitchell and his partner Jensen were hired by the DoD to teach SEER techniques to psychologists for use in Guantanamo. Okay? That report concluded that psychologists responded to a call from the Bush administration and Secretary Rumsfeld's office to reverse engineer the use of SEER interrogation techniques in Guantanamo, later Afghanistan, and Iraq. According to the Inspector General's report, this operation was undertaken first by Guantanamo Biscuits. Biscuits, if you don't know, are behavior science consulting teams. They always include at least one psychologist, usually a psychiatrist also. And to quote the report for a minute, Guantanamo behavior science consultant team personnel understood that they to review documentation and standard operating procedures for SEER training in developing the standard operating procedure for the JTF-170. JTF-170, the people working Guantanamo. So it was clear that that was the purpose, to use these techniques in Guantanamo. So at this time, reporters then who got a hold of this story would go to the American Psychiatric Association, and Steve Sharfstein at the time was president of the American Psychiatric Association, and he would say there's absolutely no place for psychiatry in these institutions, in these places, in use of these techniques. It's absolutely unethical according to our standards. They would go to Steve Benke, who's here, who's spokesman for the APA, and Steve would say things like, well, you know, there are, at least in the news reports, in the reports, would say, well, you know, there are vague areas here. How much water is waterboarding? How much darkness is torture? How much light is torture? They're vague, ambiguous areas. And that's how you're quoted, whether it's right or not. That's your quote in the news media. In August of '05, there was a resolution passed by the Council of Representatives of the APA, that's the governing body of the APA, to ask the Ethics Committee to consider changing the Ethics Code so that any supervening principle over the Ethics Code must be in accordance with basic human rights. Now, to make this perfectly clear, the purpose of this was so that the Nuremberg defense would no longer apply, because you couldn't do something that would violate basic human rights and say I was ordered to do so. You couldn't do anything you were ordered to do as long if it in any way violated human rights. So that was what they asked the Ethics Committee to do. We're here 2 years later in October of '07. Nothing has been done on that. In October of '05, about that same time, Dr. Ron Levant went to Guantanamo. Levant was, at that point, I believe, president of APA, because then Kuchar was last year. Levant was at that time president of APA. He spent, by his own admission, a total of no more than 4 hours at Guantanamo, had no contact with detainees, saw no interrogations, and he was quoted to the effect, well, basically said that psychologists are not committing any ethical violations. But he said his purpose was not to